Book of Acts, Lesson 7, Part 2. Stephen's Witness Sealed in Blood. As time drew near for God to fulfill his promise to Abraham, the number of our people in Egypt greatly increased. Then another king who knew nothing about Joseph became ruler in Egypt. He dealt treacherously with our people and oppressed our forefathers by forcing them to throw out their newborn babies so that they would die. At that time Moses was born, and he was no ordinary child. For 3 months he was cared for in his father's house. These verses are a summary of Exodus 1 to Exodus 2. Whatever information the new king of Egypt might have had, he would not be influenced by what Joseph had done for Egypt at the time of the famine. By faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born because they saw he was no ordinary child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict, Hebrews 11 tells us. Acts 5 says we must obey God rather than men. That's why they hid Moses against Pharaoh's wishes. When he was placed outside, Pharaoh's daughter took him and brought him up as her own son. Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was powerful in speech and in action. For more detail concerning Moses' rescue, read Exodus 2, verse 3 to 10. In Exodus 4, verse 10, we read that Moses said, "O Lord, I have never been eloquent. I am slow of speech and tongue." In verse 12, God then promised, "I will help you speak, and I will teach you what to say." The content of what Moses said and the way in which he led Israel were from God, and they were, as Stephen said, powerful. When Moses was 40 years old, he decided to visit his fellow Israelites. He saw one of them being mistreated by an Egyptian, so he went to his defense and avenged him by killing the Egyptian. Moses thought that his own people would realize that God was using him to rescue them, but they did not. The next day Moses came upon 2 Israelites who were fighting. He tried to reconcile them by saying, "Men, you are brothers. Why do you want to hurt each other?" But the man who was mistreating the other pushed Moses aside and said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Do you want to kill me as you killed the Egyptian yesterday?" When Moses heard this, he fled to Midian, where he settled as a foreigner and had 2 sons. These verses summarize Exodus 2, verse 11 to 12. Moses' decision to visit his people was prompted not so much by curiosity as by concern. His concern was commendable, but his action in killing the Egyptian was not. God had not yet called him to act on behalf of Israel, and God never called him to take justice into his own hands. Hebrews 11 provides an evaluation of why Moses identified himself with his own people. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God, rather to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a short time. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as a greater value than all the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward. In verses 27 and 28, we have another example of the Israelites rejecting the man whom God planned to use for their rescue. Midian was east of Egypt, divided into 2 regions by the Gulf of Aqaba. Moses' 2 sons, Gershom and Eleazar, are named in Exodus 18. After 40 years had passed, an angel appeared to Moses in the flames of a burning bush in the desert near Mount Sinai. When he saw this, he was amazed at the sight, and he went over to look more closely. He heard the Lord's voice. "I am the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." Moses trembled with fear and did not dare to look. Then the Lord said to him, "Take off your sandals. The place where you are standing is holy ground. I have indeed seen the oppression of my people in Egypt. I have heard their groaning and have come to set them free. Now come, I will send you back to Egypt." This is the same Moses whom they had rejected with their words, "Who made you ruler and judge?" He was sent to be their ruler and deliverer by God himself, through the angel who appeared to him in the bush. Sinai in Acts and Horeb in Exodus are 2 names for the same mountain. The call of Moses is recorded in Exodus chapter 3. When the NIV translates Stephen's words as an angel, it could as well have been translated as the angel. The Greek would allow either translation. A look at Exodus 3 verse 2, to which Stephen here was referring, makes clear that it should be the angel. It was the angel of the Lord, the second person of the Trinity before his incarnation, who appeared to Moses at the burning bush. Israel had rejected Moses as ruler and judge. God sent him to be ruler and deliverer. He led them out of Egypt and did wonders and miraculous signs in Egypt, at the Red Sea, and for 40 years in the desert. The story of the deliverance from Egypt is told in Exodus chapters 11 to 14. Stephen's Red Sea comes from the Greek translation of the Old Testament. The Hebrew in Exodus 13 says Sea of Reeds, which was the northern extension of the Red Sea. By faith he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered because he saw him who is invisible. By faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch the firstborn of Israel. By faith the people passed through the Red Sea and on dry land. But when the Egyptians tried to do so, they were drowned. That had been a special time of grace for Israel. The wonders and miraculous signs of Stephen and the apostles were evidence that a new time of special grace for Israel had now dawned. How long would it last? What would Israel do with it? This is that Moses who told the Israelites, God will send you a prophet like me from your own people. Peter had also cited this passage and he addressed the crowd who gathered when the crippled man was healed. That prophet foretold by Moses in Deuteronomy 18 had arrived. He had been put to death, but God had raised him to life. So what would Israel do? Throughout the speech, Stephen was not so much defending himself, but calling his judges to repentance. He was in the assembly in the desert with the angel who spoke to him on Mount Sinai, and with our fathers, and he received living words to pass on to us. The assembly in the desert was the congregation of Israel. The Israelites were not only a nation, they were also God's church. Those who trusted the promises of God were a congregation of believers. The angel who spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai refers to the angel of the Lord, which is Jesus before he became Jesus, who had addressed him at the burning bush. The angel was God himself, who later gave Moses the living words on the same Mount Sinai. Living words are words that endure and that are still valid. Stephen was speaking of brief sayings, and he meant that the 10 Commandments. For the Old Testament account of giving of the law, see Exodus chapters 19 and 20. But our fathers refused to obey him. Instead, they rejected Moses, and in their hearts turned back to Egypt. They told Aaron, "Make us gods who will go before us. As for this Moses who led us out of Egypt, we don't know what happened to him." That was the time they made an idol in the form of a calf. They brought sacrifices to it and held a celebration in honor of what their hands had made. Again, the Israelites rejected the man whom God had sent to mediate between himself and them. This fellow, Moses, was an expression of their contempt for the God-sent deliverer. They did not really care what happened to him. They turned to the folly of worshiping the man-made image of a creature. They had not only rejected the man through whom God had led them out of slavery, they also rejected God and returned to their worship of the gods of Egypt. These follies are recorded in Exodus chapter 32. But God turned away and gave them over to the worship of heavenly bodies. This agrees with what was written in the book of the prophets. Did you bring me sacrifices and offerings 40 years in the desert, O house of Israel? No, you lifted up the shrine of Moloch and the star of your god Rephan, the idols you made to worship. Therefore I will send you into exile beyond Babylon. The book of the prophets here means the Hebrew scroll that contained the prophets of Hosea to Malachi. The particular prophet whom Stephen quoted is Amos in chapter 5. The answer to his question about sacrifice is no. The Israelites had made sacrifices, but not to God, because their hearts were still set on the gods of Egypt. Therefore he did not accept their sacrifices. When Amos spoke these words, he was also speaking of all the idolatry that followed during Israel's long history, even in his own time. Around 755 BC, Amos foretold the Assyrian captivity of the northern kingdom, Israel, beyond Damascus. This captivity of the southern kingdom, Judah, in Babylon came after that. With the expression, beyond Babylon, Stephen was warning that something even worse would happen to those who rejected Christ. Once again, Stephen was quoting from the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, which did not translate Amos's words literally. The Hebrew says king instead of Moloch. It says pedestal instead of Rephan. The point of Stephen's quotation is not lost, however. He simply wanted to remind his hearers of the Israelites' history of gross idolatry, of which they had been guilty despite God's faithful grace to them. He did not blaspheme Moses and the law. He regarded them as from God, and condemned the way in which Israel's ancestors had consistently rejected both. In acknowledging Moses' greatness and attributing it to God's grace, Stephen certainly discredited the false witnesses and the charges they had made that he spoke against Moses. Our forefathers had the tabernacle of the testimony with them in the desert. It had been made as God directed Moses, according to the pattern he had seen. Having received the tabernacle, our fathers under Joshua brought it with them when they took the land from the nations that God drove out before them. It remained in the land until the time of David, who enjoyed God's favor and asked that he might provide a dwelling place for the God of Jacob. But it was Solomon who built the house for him. The false witnesses had accused Stephen of speaking against the temple. Did he? Stephen did point out that their ancestors had worshipped at the tabernacle for many years before the temple was built. They had been the people of Israel, and God had been their God even then before the temple. The testimony was the law, written on two stone tablets. These tablets had been kept in the tabernacle, and so one of the terms used for Israel's worship place was the tabernacle of the testimony. Some interpreters believe that it had been that name because it was the testimony to God's presence. It certainly was that too. On the pattern for the tabernacle and its building, see Exodus 25. For hundreds of years, the tabernacle was the only house of worship Israel had. Even in the glorious reign of the great King David, there was no temple, although he expressed a desire to build one. In verses 45 and 46, he was summarizing Joshua 3 and 24, 2 Samuel 7, and 1 Kings 8. On Solomon's building of the temple, see 1 Kings 6 and 1 Kings 8. However, the Most High does not live in houses made by men. As the prophet says, "Heaven is my home, and earth is my footstool. What kind of house will you build for me, says the Lord? Or where will my resting place be? Has not my hand made all these things?" Solomon himself was aware that the Most High does not live in houses made by men. The point of Stephen's quotation from Isaiah 66 is that the great God, he has no need for anything that people might build. The maker of heaven and earth did not really need the temple. What he wants is believing hearts and obedient lives. The picture of the footstool here is not intended to express the idea of subjecting an enemy. The image here is that God's greatness. The whole earth is only like a small piece of furniture for him. The temple served its purpose as a house of prayer for all nations, a gathering place for God's people, a reassuring sign of God's presence, and a place of sacrifice. In that way, it served the spiritual needs of Israel. But the need for a temple was never absolute, for God's presence was never limited to that place. And after the great service and sacrifice of Jesus, the temple and its services and sacrifices were not really needed at all. Once the great high priest, Jesus, had done his saving work, the lessons and reminders of the temple were no longer required. Stephen's criticism, like Jesus' criticism, was not of the temple as such. That was God's house serving his people. The problem lay in what the Sadducees and others had made of it, a center of formal worship without heart and without spirit. There was too much concern with the externals or outside of the building and of the worship, and too little concern with the inward condition of the heart. Stephen was not speaking against the temple, but putting it in proper perspective. Stephen was speaking against the lack of perspective that gave the temple too much honor and God too little.